If I compiled every comment and chat on a stream I got about how stratagems and command points are killing 40k and should be removed entirely, I'd have enough in the resulting video to make like a full-length feature film. Like a fantasy epic with way too much exposition. Seriously, that would be about 3 hours of content. So in the interest of nipping this discussion in the bud and answering all of those comments all at once, let's cover the question, should 40k get rid of stratagems? What's up, folks? Welcome back to TacticalTortoise. My name is Trevi, and it's time for another discussion video. As always, in this video series, we sit back, take a long, cool sip of delicious soda pop or tea or stimulating coffee or hard liquor.
Thank you very much.
And boot up some Warhammers to 40,000 Space Marines and talk about a 40k thing. Stratagems are a controversial topic in Warhammer 40,000 for whatever reason. They're not an original part of the game and were introduced in 8th edition alongside command points. And while I'm not privy to any super secret info from the design team, I imagine this was in an effort to add resource mechanics to 40k in order to compete with other games in the market at the time. Something the game had never had, but at the time was running rampant around the tabletop gaming industry. Games like War Machine and Hordes and Malifaux were quickly eating up Warhammer's market share, and were rife with this style of design. Even games like X-Wing had similar rules, with its focus, dodge, and target lock token economy. In contrast, Warhammer's gameplay was simplistic, basic, and, at the risk of editorializing too much, super duper dumb. With very few interacting mechanics and most of the combat in the game coming down to essentially binary stat checks, or just good old riverboat gambling as you tried to pierce an armor that your AP value didn't touch with millions of mostly inconsequential bullets. While there is strategy to the game, you get to decide when your units elect to break cover, which objectives you move for, and, some tactics you can take advantage of, like target priority and abusing the poorly written combat movement mechanics. There were few mechanics with continuity from turn to turn, and very little in the way of interaction between the players, which gave way to franchise-threatening criticisms about 40k's deficiencies in its turn-by-turn gameplay. When you think about it, back in the day, there was actually no reason to even require that armor saves be rolled by the defending player in an attack sequence. In 7th edition 40k, wound allocation was forced to the closest defending model to the attacking unit. And since there was no defensive interaction like command rerolls or reactive stratagems, the attacker could have just resolved 90% of their turn without any input from the other player whatsoever. That's not fun or engaging gameplay, that's just a comparison of numbers and dice math. So with that dystopian hellscape of game in mind, should Warhammer 40k actually get rid of stratagems? And the answer is yeah, kinda. The stratagem system has a lot of problems, the most notable being cognitive load. If there's one thing that 40k designers lack, it's any sort of restraint whatsoever. Into what should be a simple system, they can't help but throw endless and largely superfluous stratagems. There are so many stratagems in the game that are only useful in niche circumstances, with specific units or even in specific matchups, that using the system optimally becomes more about rote memorization than any sort of actual strategy. And even worse, with such a breadth of options, it's also hard to know at a guess which of them are any good if you're not practiced with the faction. And as we've talked about at length before, the broken codex system creates stratagems with outdated wording, causing multiple effects to have extremely slight differences in mechanics that can be agonizing to keep them all straight. It's an overly complex system that only ends up getting used for a handful of stratagems in any particular list. So that all is to say, I don't think that the stratagem system should be removed entirely. A return to the boring, non-interactive garbage fire of a game that almost killed the franchise back in 6th and 7th editions isn't in anyone's best interest, but it definitely needs a rework. And I think the best way to do that is to reduce the number of effects that we're dealing with. Let's take stratagems that can only be used on a single unit or a small selection of units, for example. There are no reason for these to be included in a universal pool of faction stratagems. What I'd like to see is for these effects to be removed to units' datasheets. Let's call them something like command abilities. Abilities that are activated with command points, making it more obvious and simpler to remember which of these situational effects a player has available to them at any one time. If you don't play an army with Reavers in it, you don't have to worry about wasting space in your codex with Terror Troops, because it's not on any of your datasheets. You can even create a mechanical framework out of this system, with electronic or communications warfare style abilities that disrupt enemy command abilities within a certain range. Would this warrant a wholesale rework of the system? No, probably not. But I do think that it needs some pruning at the very least. Every faction has a lot of useless garbage that can be removed to reduce bloat, and additional rule sets like sub-factions, armies of renown, and army supplements shouldn't contribute more than 1 or 2 stratagems to the whole, not the full page that many of them provide now. The truly dizzying complexity comes when combining a faction's starting list of stratagems with ones added from an army supplement and an army of renown, which can effectively triple the number of secondaries available to that army, as well as the layers of potentially busted combos and level of cognitive load that they can generate. That all said, before we move too far on, I do want to take a moment to recognize that most recent codexes have done a lot to improve the stratagem system, cutting down on the most degenerate multi-step combos that plagued the game in the past, especially in 8th edition, and generally reducing the overall number of stratagems. In my opinion, the platonic ideal of the system, without redesigning 40k from the ground up, would feature maybe 4 actually impactful stratagems for each army that define how that army plays. A few more could come from a standardized pool. After all, there's no reason to reprint transhuman physiology 20 times if half the factions in the game have access to some version of it. Then, the remainder be made up by the command abilities printed on select units datasheets that we talked about earlier. Miniature games cannot be carried by their turn structure and combat system alone. They need something else to keep the gameplay interactive and engaging. And for 40k, those are stratagems and command points. So, to answer the initial thesis of the video, should 40k actually get rid of strats and CP? The answer, while maybe yes from a technical standpoint, where the system needs to be redesigned, overhauled, or potentially replaced, it's spiritually no. And while I'd like to see the system redesigned in a way that reduces its issues and complexity, and I'm not saying it shouldn't be replaced with something else that's superior, without the extra gameplay zest that effects like stratagems have on 40k, the game would be back to the dark days of a boring snooze fest that was classic Warhammer. The industry, community, and state of game design has moved pretty far past those days. And for the folks railing against the stratagem system in modern 40k, it's probably time for you to do so as well. And that's it! That's everything I have to talk about stratagems today. Let me know down in the comments what you think about this particular discussion. I know there's a lot of people with some pretty opinionated viewpoints, and I'd love to hear them. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end of the video, and big thanks as well to everyone who supports the channel, either over on Patreon at patreon.com/TacticalTortoise, YouTube channel members, Twitch subscribers. All those people are great, and I love them. Remember to keep it classy, folks, and have happy wargaming.